In May 1976, Stephen Spurrier, a British wine merchant based in Paris, organized a blind tasting at the Intercontinental Hotel. He invited the best French wine judges he could assemble, sommeliers, critics, and restaurateurs who set the global standard for what distinguished wine from mere alcohol. He served them 15 wines poured into identical glasses without labels, 9 French, 6 Californian. The judges tasted, scored, and handed in their sheets. When Spurrier's colleague tallied the results, the top-ranked white wine was a Chardonnay from Chateau Montelena in Napa Valley. The top-ranked red was a Cabernet Sauvignon from Stag's Leap Wine Cellars, also Napa. The French wines had lost to California at a tasting in Paris, judged by French experts who had not known what they were drinking. The reactions were immediate. One judge, told which wine she had scored highest, said the result must reflect her difficulties that day. Another attempted to retrieve his scoring sheet. The director of France's Wine Appellation Authority disputed the methodology. The French press largely declined to cover the event. Time magazine ran a short piece in the United States. The story became what wine historians call the Judgment of Paris, the afternoon that ended a century of unquestioned French wine supremacy. In a 2-hour tasting that France officially treated as a non-event. This is not a story about French wine being inferior. It is a story about what happens when one product, one country, and one set of traditions accumulate so much prestige over so many centuries that the prestige becomes a fact rather than an argument. And what happens when that fact meets a blind tasting? Understanding how France got there requires going back not to Burgundy or Bordeaux, but to the mountains of what is now the Republic of Georgia, around 6000 BC. Someone buried a clay jar in the earth and left it to work through the winter. Origins, the world's oldest wine. The oldest confirmed evidence of intentional winemaking in the world comes from the South Caucasus. In 2017, archaeologists working at 2 Neolithic sites south of Tbilisi, Gadatrili Gora and Shulaveris Gora, found ceramic vessels dating to between 6000 and 5800 BC. Inside them were residues of tartaric acid, malic acid, citric acid, and succinic acid, the chemical signature of fermented grape juice. The vessels were qvevri, large egg-shaped clay jars designed to be buried in the earth, sealed with beeswax. And they predate the next oldest winemaking evidence found in Armenia and Iran by several centuries. The grape species involved was Vitis vinifera, the same species that produces every bottle of Burgundy, Bordeaux, Barolo, and Rioja today. Vitis vinifera originated in the South Caucasus and grew wild across the mountain forests of modern Georgia, Armenia, and northeastern Turkey. Wild grapes carry everything wine requires: sugar in ripe fruit, wild yeasts living on grape skins, and a climate that allows fermentation to proceed slowly enough to produce something drinkable rather than immediately putrid. Wine almost certainly happened before anyone decided to make it. Overripe grapes in a sealed clay vessel, the yeasts activating in the absence of air, producing a liquid that was intoxicating and preserved better than the fruit itself. What the Neolithic Georgians added was intention. The qvevri jars at Gadatrili Gora were purpose-built, lined with beeswax, buried to keep temperatures stable across seasons, and used systematically rather than accidentally. Wine in the South Caucasus by 6000 BC was not a discovery. It was a practice, already scaled beyond the accidental, produced deliberately by people who understood the process well enough to build equipment for it. This was happening before the Sumerians had writing. before the Egyptian pyramids existed, before anything recognizable as urban civilization had appeared in most of the world. Georgia has never stopped making wine this way. The qvevri tradition persisted through Greek colonization, Roman conquest, Persian invasion, Mongol destruction, Russian imperial annexation, and Soviet collectivization. Today, Georgian natural wine made in buried clay jars is one of the fastest-growing categories in the global fine wine market. Orange wines, skin contact wines, unfiltered, unfined, amber in color, and tannic in character, made as they were 8,000 years ago. The oldest wine tradition in the world is simultaneously the newest trend in the best wine bars in London, New York, and Tokyo. This story ends where it begins: Egypt, Greece, and the invention of wine culture. Wine moved out of the South Caucasus through trade routes and Greek colonization of the Black Sea coast. By 3000 BC, it was present in Egypt, where it appeared in tomb paintings, administrative records, and royal cellars as both a luxury and a political instrument. Egyptian wine was expensive enough that only the wealthy could afford it regularly, and its quality was tracked through a primitive classification system. Labels on wine amphorae from Egyptian estates note the vintage, the producer, the vineyard location, and a quality assessment: good, good, or doubly good. This is the first written evidence of wine evaluation in history. Egyptians were writing wine reviews before the Greeks invented the alphabet. Greece transformed wine from a luxury into a social institution. The symposium, the formal drinking gathering of Greek aristocratic men, was organized around wine diluted with water, discussion, music, and what the Greeks called the pleasures of the mind. Drinking undiluted wine was considered barbaric, the mark of people who had not learned to moderate their appetites. The standard ratio at a symposium was 3 parts water to 1 part wine, or 2 to 1, enough to produce mild intoxication over several hours, calibrated to keep the conversation intelligent rather than degraded. Wine in this framework was a civilizing technology, what distinguished Greek culture from the cultures that surrounded it. The god of wine, Dionysus, was also the god of theater, of ecstasy, and of transformation. The religious festivals in his honor produced the first Greek dramas. Tragedy and comedy both emerged from the same ritual context as communal drinking and altered consciousness. This connection was not incidental to Greek culture. It was central. The two great products of the Greek mind that Western civilization claims as its foundation, rational philosophy and theatrical drama, both emerged from a culture that organized its social and intellectual life around a fermented beverage. The Platonic dialogues emerged from the culture of the symposium. Plato's greatest philosophical work is called the Symposium, and it is set at a drinking party where the subject of discussion is the nature of love. Greek colonization carried viticulture westward across the Mediterranean. The Greek settlement at Massalia, the future Marseille, introduced wine cultivation to the region that would become the most celebrated wine-producing area in the world. The local Gallic populations traded gold, tin, and slaves for Greek wine amphorae in quantities that archaeologists have found across southern France in their thousands. The hunger for wine in France predates the vines by centuries. The French did not create wine culture. Greek colonists brought it to them, and the Gauls wanted it badly enough to sell their own people for it. The economic scale of the Greek wine trade is sometimes underappreciated because it operated before the kind of administrative records that would make it legible to later historians. But the archaeological evidence fills the gap. Amphorae from specific Greek production centers, identified by their clay composition, their stamped handles, their characteristic profiles, appear at Celtic hill forts in northern France and at Iberian settlements in Spain. They appear at trading posts along the Black Sea coast and at sites in southern Russia and Ukraine. The Greek wine trade was, at its height in the 5th and 4th centuries BC, one of the most extensive commercial networks the ancient world had yet produced. Wine was not incidental to Greek expansion. It was one of its primary engines. Rome, the first wine empire. Rome took Greek wine culture and industrialized it. At its peak, the Roman Empire produced wine on a scale the world would not see again until the 19th century. Vineyards covered the hills of Italy, Spain, France, and North Africa. Roman wine moved through the empire in standardized ceramic amphorae, whose remains, recognizable by their distinctive shapes and stamped producer marks, trace the geography of Roman trade with more precision than almost any other artifact. Monte Testaccio in Rome, a hill some 50 meters tall, is made from broken amphorae, the ancient equivalent of a landfill, built from the containers of 1 million wine deliveries deposited over several centuries. The Roman wine market was stratified in ways that modern fine wine would recognize. Falernian, from the volcanic slopes of Campania, was the most prestigious wine of the Roman world. Aged for decades in sealed amphora, drunk only at elite banquets, mentioned by Pliny, Horace, and Virgil as the standard against which other wines were measured. Ordinary wine, the posca that soldiers drank diluted with water and vinegar, was produced on large agricultural estates in what is now southern France and Spain, and shipped in bulk to ports around the Mediterranean. The Roman wine market had already worked out the basic commercial architecture of first growths and mass market production that the 1855 Bordeaux classification would codify 18 centuries later. Wine also structured Roman social life in ways that go beyond the symposium model Greece had established. Romans drank wine at every meal, at social events, at religious ceremonies, and as everyday medicine. A Roman cookbook, Apicius, written in the early imperial period, includes wine as an ingredient in dozens of dishes in ways that imply it was as routinely available as water. The difference was that water was free and wine was not, which meant that the quality of wine someone drank and the occasions on which they drank it were both legible markers of social position. A slave drank posca. A freedman drank cheap Gallic table wine. A senator drank Falernian, if he wanted to signal that he could. Wine in Rome was not just a beverage, it was a vocabulary of status. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century AD, produced a classification of Italian wines by quality and region directly recognizable as the ancestor of classification systems governing fine wine today. He described specific hillsides as superior to adjacent valleys, identified outstanding vintages going back a century, and noted which regions had declined as commercial production crowded out quality. He also articulated what French wine would later call terroir, the idea that specific geographic conditions produce specific wine characters that cannot be replicated elsewhere. When Pliny described the volcanic soils of the slopes above the Bay of Naples as producing wines of unusual richness, he was making an argument about place and wine that Burgundy would not formalize until the 12th century. Roman winemakers in Gaul also introduced something more practically important than classification: the barrel. Adapting to local craft traditions, they began using oak barrels alongside traditional amphorae for wine storage and transport. Oak's characteristics, its porosity allowing slow oxygen exchange, its natural compounds adding tannin and vanilla notes over time, produced wines that aged differently and in many cases more interestingly than amphora-stored wine. The oak barrel became the dominant wine vessel in Europe after Rome's fall, and remained so until the 20th century. It was a Gallic innovation adopted by Roman winemakers that became the technology through which virtually all premium wine was aged for 2,000 years. When the Roman system collapsed in the 5th century, the wine trade collapsed with it. The long-distance amphora networks dissolved. The large agricultural estates that had supplied wine across the empire reverted to local subsistence farming. Wine production did not disappear, but the administrative infrastructure that had sustained large-scale trade and the urban markets that had supported demand for high quality were gone. Wine survived the fall of Rome for one reason: the Church needed it. The Church saves wine and accidentally invents champagne. The Eucharist requires wine. This single liturgical fact preserved viticulture in Europe through the centuries after Rome's collapse. Monasteries needed wine for Mass. Monasteries were simultaneously the most stable, best funded, and most literate institutions in post-Roman Europe. The combination produced something that no secular institution of the period could have sustained: a continuous tradition of careful wine production across several centuries of political instability, when the trading systems that had made commercial quality winemaking viable were gone. The Benedictine and Cistercian monasteries of Burgundy are responsible for identifying the vineyard parcels that are now Grand Cru Burgundy. Monks walked the same fields across generations, tasting fruit, comparing harvests, noting which parcels consistently produced superior wine. They had institutional memory that commercial operations almost never accumulate, and motivation that went beyond profit. Wine was for the mass that connected the community to God, and producing inferior wine was a religious failure as much as an economic one. They also had enough stability to observe the same parcels across centuries rather than decades. The Clos de Vougeot, one of the most famous vineyards in the world, was created by Cistercian monks who built a stone wall around the parcel they had identified as producing the best wine in the Côte de Nuits. The vineyards those monks identified as superior in the 12th and 13th centuries are substantially the same parcels that command $500 a bottle today. The Cistercians did not just make wine in Burgundy, they created it. Dompierre Perignon, the 17th century Benedictine cellarer at the Abbey of Oviers in the Champagne region, is commonly credited with inventing champagne. The story is wrong on nearly every detail. Sparkling wine was occurring in the Champagne region before Perignon arrived, and English merchants who received still champagne wine and bottled it with added sugar may have understood the secondary fermentation that produces bubbles before Perignon was born. What Perignon actually spent most of his career doing was the opposite. He tried to eliminate the bubbles, which were considered a defect, a sign of incomplete fermentation that left sugar unconverted. The attributed remark, "Come quickly, I am tasting the stars," is almost certainly invented by a monk writing about Perignon 70 years after his death. Perignon's real contributions were to blending technique and quality control. He may have been the first to deliberately blend juice from multiple parcels to create a consistent house style, understanding that no single parcel produces the same wine in every vintage. Combining them intelligently produces something more reliable than any of its components. This is now standard practice in champagne production and in many other wine regions. His contribution was not the bubbles, it was the blend. The truth about champagne's origins is stranger than the myth. Bubbles occurred because the Champagne region's cold climate stopped fermentation before all the sugar was consumed. The wine was bottled. Spring arrived. The yeasts reactivated in the warming temperatures, and the CO2 produced had nowhere to escape. Early champagne bottles exploded regularly. Historical records from 17th-century cellars describe losing 20 to 40% of stock each spring to spontaneous detonations. Cellar workers wore iron face masks. It was the British, receiving the wine in barrels and bottling it themselves with added sugar, who first recognized the bubbles as the product rather than the problem. They ordered stronger bottles from English glassmakers, developed the wire cage to hold the cork against the pressure, and created the market for sparkling wine. The drink most associated with French celebration was created by English merchants solving a storage problem with French wine. Napoleon and the 8-week classification. The 1855 classification of Bordeaux wines is one of the most consequential documents in the history of food and drink. It was produced by the Bordeaux Chamber of Commerce on 8 weeks' notice at the request of Napoleon III for a trade exhibition. In 1853, Napoleon III commissioned a grand universal exposition for Paris, scheduled for 1855, to showcase French commercial and industrial achievement. He wanted a display of French wine for the exposition's visitors. The Chamber of Commerce of Bordeaux was asked to organize a classification of its wines. The Chamber, without time or resources to conduct independent evaluations, asked the Bordeaux wine brokers, the négociants who actually bought and sold the wine, to rank the chateaux. The brokers did what brokers do. They ranked by market price. The chateaux that had consistently commanded the highest prices over the previous decades became premier cru. Those with the next highest prices became deuxième cru, and so down to cinquième cru. The document reflected the market's collective assessment of quality, as expressed in price over time, not an independent expert judgment. The 1855 classification has barely changed since. Of the original 61 classified chateaux, 60 remain in exactly the same position today. The only exception is Mouton Rothschild, elevated from second to first growth in 1973 after decades of sustained lobbying by Baron Philippe de Rothschild. Ownership of every classified chateau has changed. Winemaking practices have transformed. Critical assessments have shifted substantially. The list has not moved. Chateaux making exceptional wine today that were unremarkable in 1855 remain unclassified. Chateaux that were outstanding in 1855 but have since declined remain classified at their original level. The durability of the 1855 system is partly explained by the same mechanism that made the judgment of Paris so threatening. Prestige compounds. A first growth sells for a high price partly because it is a first growth. That high price confirms its first growth status. The classification and the price became mutually sustaining in a way that made any revision of either extremely difficult. Changing the classification would mean acknowledging that the price hierarchy had drifted from the quality hierarchy, a recognition that the market's participants had enormous financial incentive to resist. The 8-week document produced for a trade exhibition became the self-reinforcing architecture of one of the most valuable commodity markets in the world, precisely because nobody who profited from it had any interest in questioning it. The 1855 classification also produced something its authors had not intended, a model for wine prestige that spread across the fine wine world. Burgundy developed its own classification, organized around Premier Cru and Grand Cru vineyard parcels rather than chateau ownership. Italy developed its DOC and DOCG systems. Spain created its denominaciones. Germany built its predicat hierarchy. Each system was different in structure, but identical in function. A formal declaration that some wine was, by definition, more prestigious than other wine, and that this hierarchy was official, stable, and not subject to revision based on current performance. Napoleon III had asked for a list of good wines for a trade exhibition. He got the architecture of fine wine culture for the next 2 centuries. Phylloxera, the American aphid that destroyed Europe. In the early 1860s, Jules-Émile Planchon, a French botanist investigating vine disease in the southern Rhône Valley, noticed vines dying in a geographic pattern that suggested transmission rather than soil disease. He examined the roots of dying vines under a microscope and found them covered with tiny yellow insects, a species he had never seen before. He identified it as an aphid native to the eastern United States, Dactylosphera vidifolii, grape phylloxera, transported to Europe almost certainly on specimens of American vine species shipped to European botanical collections as scientific curiosities. American grape species had co-evolved with phylloxera over millions of years and developed resistance. European Vitis vinifera had no prior exposure and no resistance. The aphid fed on roots, disrupting nutrient uptake, and the vines died within a few years of infection. From its first appearance in the southern Rhône in the early 1860s, phylloxera reached Burgundy, Bordeaux, Champagne, and every wine region in Europe. By 1880, France had lost roughly a third of its vineyard area. By 1900, European losses were closer to half. Entire wine-producing traditions that had existed for centuries were destroyed within a generation. The devastation was not uniform, but it was comprehensive. In Cognac, the brandy-producing region whose white wine base varieties were highly susceptible, the industry nearly collapsed. In Bordeaux, the classified chateau had sufficient capital to replant when the solution was eventually found. Lesser producers did not. In Burgundy, the monasteries that had created Grand Cru viticulture over 7 centuries lost the vines they had tended, and the accumulated knowledge of which specific parcels were superior survived only in written records and institutional memory. The diversity of European wine, the accumulated variety of local traditions that had developed in geographical isolation over centuries, was partially erased in 40 years. The devastation was not uniform, but it was comprehensive. In Cognac, the brandy-producing region whose white wine base varieties were highly susceptible, the industry nearly collapsed. In Bordeaux, the classified chateau had sufficient capital to replant when the solution eventually came. Lesser producers did not. In Burgundy, the monasteries that had created Grand Cru viticulture over 7 centuries lost the vines they had tended. In parts of southern France and Spain, local grape varieties that had been cultivated for centuries disappeared because nobody replanted them when they died. The diversity of European wine, the accumulated variety of local traditions that had developed in geographical isolation, was significantly erased in 40 years. Debate over the solution was bitter and prolonged. Some French winemakers proposed flooding vineyards to drown the aphid. Others proposed injecting carbon disulfide into the soil, a lethal poison that killed the insect but also damaged the vine and anyone who breathed it in sufficient quantity. The French government convened commissions, offered prizes, and funded research for nearly 2 decades without finding a reliable solution. The answer, when it came, was both elegant and deeply ironic. Graft European Vitis vinifera vines onto American rootstock. American vine roots could resist phylloxera. European vines grafted onto those roots could use them as a foundation while still producing their own fruit above the graft union, preserving the character of the European variety entirely above the grafting point. The first successful large-scale graftings were made in the late 1870s and 1880s, and the technique gradually spread through the devastated regions as evidence accumulated that it worked. This means that every bottle of wine produced in France, Italy, Spain, Germany, or Portugal today, with rare exceptions from a handful of ungrafted vineyards where Phylloxera has never established, is grown on American roots. The roots are American. The European character of the wine comes from the grafted wood above the graft union alone. Romanée Conti, the most expensive wine in the world, grows on American roots. Chateau Petrus grows on American roots. The wines the French judges served at the Judgment of Paris in 1976, the wines they expected to outperform California, grew on American roots. The irony was complete before the tasting began. If this is the kind of history you want, the stories underneath the stories, the connections that standard accounts leave out, subscribe. What comes next is just as strange. Prohibition: How America Destroyed and Rebuilt Its Own Wine. The 18th Amendment, which took effect in January 1920, decimated the American wine industry. Before Prohibition, California had roughly 700 wineries, producing wine of increasing quality, drawing on traditions brought by German, Italian, and French immigrants who had understood California's climate as comparable to the European regions they had left. By 1925, a handful of operations producing legally permitted sacramental wine were still running. The rest had closed, been converted, or were producing bootleg spirits whose quality ranged from mediocre to dangerous. Prohibition did not eliminate wine, it redirected it. A legal provision allowed home winemakers to produce up to 200 gallons per year for personal use, which created immediate demand for wine grapes that could be shipped across the country to home producers. California grape growers responded by planting thick-skinned, high-yielding varieties that could survive weeks of transcontinental rail shipping without rotting. The Alicante Bouschet, almost unknown before Prohibition, became one of California's most planted grapes because its thick skin and dense juice could withstand the journey. It makes mediocre wine. Surviving the train ride was the point. The cultural damage ran deeper than the viticultural damage. 13 years of Prohibition reshaped American drinking culture away from wine and toward spirits, toward whiskey and gin, which were stronger, easier to conceal, and higher margin for the illegal distribution networks that served them. When Prohibition ended in 1933, wine was starting from behind a double deficit. Vineyards replanted with shipping-resistant varieties, and a market that had learned to drink differently. Rebuilding both would take decades, and would require a particular kind of person. Someone who had been to France, understood what European wine was, and believed California could do something comparable. The repeal of Prohibition in December 1933 produced an immediate but short-lived burst of winery openings, most of which produced undistinguished wine from the wrong grapes and closed within a decade. The Depression made investment difficult. The Second World War diverted the resources and attention of anyone who might have rebuilt quality. American wine culture was still recovering from 13 years of enforced interruption, when the post-war period brought new wealth to exactly the demographic. Educated, traveled, aspirationally sophisticated, that would eventually create the market for premium domestic wine. That market took 20 years to materialize. Robert Mondavi founded his winery in Napa Valley in 1966 after a dispute with his family over the direction of the Charles Krug winery they operated together. Mondavi had traveled to France, spent time in Bordeaux and Burgundy, understood what European wine could be and why, and came back to California, convinced that the Napa Valley climate was capable of producing something comparable. He cold fermented Sauvignon Blanc in the Bordeaux style and renamed it Fumé Blanc to give it a French-sounding name that American consumers would take seriously. He collaborated with the enology department at UC Davis, He hired European consultants. He did not try to make Napa sound like Burgundy. He made the argument that Napa was Napa, and that Napa was excellent on those terms. When Spurrier selected wines for the Judgment of Paris, the California wineries he chose were the direct products of the ecosystem Mondavi had spent a decade building. The Judgment of Paris, the full story. Spurrier had moved from England to Paris in 1971 and opened a wine shop and school in the 8th arrondissement. By 1976, he was well connected in the French wine world, which is part of what made the Judgment possible. He had the relationships to assemble genuinely credible judges. The 9 French experts he invited included the head sommelier at the Tour d'Argent, one of Paris's most celebrated restaurants, the director of the Institut National des Appellations d'Origine, and a Michelin 3-star restaurateur. These were not peripheral figures. They were, collectively, the global authority on what good wine meant. The tasting was organized to coincide with the American bicentennial, and Spurrier had visited California the previous year to select the wines. He chose 6 California whites and 4 California reds to compete against French wines from Burgundy and Bordeaux. His colleague, Patricia Gallagher, poured all 15 wines blind into identical glasses without identification. The judges tasted and scored. When Gallagher tallied the results, the California Chardonnay from Chateau Montelena had the highest aggregate score among the whites, and the California Cabernet from Stag's Leap Wine Cellars had the highest aggregate score among the reds. Several judges, told which wine they had ranked highest, expressed that the result must reflect their difficulties that day, rather than the wine's quality. The director of the Institut National reportedly attempted to retrieve his ballot. A restaurateur argued the methodology was insufficiently rigorous. Le Monde ran nothing. Le Figaro ran nothing. Time magazine published a short piece written by George Tabor, the only journalist present, and the story circulated slowly in the United States. Over the following months, it acquired the status of the defining event in the history of California wine. The follow-up tastings over the subsequent decades produced mixed results, which the French wine establishment used to argue the 1976 result was an anomaly. Spurrier organized a repeat tasting in 1978 with the same wines, aged 2 more years, and the California wines again outperformed the French. A larger repeat in 2006, using the original wines now 30 years old, produced California victories in both red and white categories. The methodology was always the same: blind tasting, identical conditions, no labels. The results kept pointing in the same direction. The French establishment kept finding reasons why the methodology was wrong. California wine, meanwhile, built the infrastructure that made the original anomaly into a permanent reordering. The decade after the 1976 judgment saw substantial new investment in Napa Valley vineyards, a generation of winemakers trained both in California and in France, and a developing critical infrastructure, wine journalists and publications that gave American consumers a vocabulary for evaluating domestic wine on its own terms rather than by comparison with French models. By the 1990s, Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon and Chardonnay were commanding prices competitive with Bordeaux and Burgundy equivalents. The Judgment of Paris had not created this. It had named something that was already becoming true and given it a story, which, as Rudy Kurniawan would later demonstrate, is often the most powerful thing that can happen to a wine. The fraud. $1.3 billion in fake Burgundy. In 2012, federal investigators searching the home of Rudy Kurniawan in Arcadia, California, found a counterfeiting operation of remarkable scale and sophistication. Kurniawan, an Indonesian-born wine collector who who had become one of the most celebrated figures in the American fine wine market, was under investigation following a complaint by Laurent Ponceau, the owner of Domaine Ponceau in Burgundy. Ponceau had been shown a catalog of wines to be auctioned that included bottles of Domaine Ponceau Clos Saint-Denis going back to 1945. The problem, which Ponceau identified immediately, was that Domaine Ponceau had not produced a Clos Saint-Denis until 1982. In Kerniawan's home, investigators found thousands of old corks from genuinely rare bottles, hundreds of authentic vintage labels from multiple producers, corking machines, capsule applicators, and laboratory equipment for preparing blended wine. His notebooks contained formulas for replicating specific wines from specific producers in specific vintages, instructions for combining percentages of different wines to approximate the taste profile of a bottle worth thousands of dollars. He had been making fake Petrus, fake Romanée Conti, and fake DRC in his kitchen, and selling them at auction for prices that reflected the presumed rarity of the wines rather than their actual contents. The losses to collectors who purchased his wines were estimated at $1.3 billion. Kerniawan was convicted of mail and wire fraud in 2013 and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. After his conviction, there was considerable anxiety in the wine collecting world about bottles purchased over the previous decade. Many had been consumed. Others sat in private cellars, authenticated by nothing more than the fact that a respected collector had vouched for them. And that collector was now in prison. The Kerniawan case revealed something the wine market had not wanted to examine. Its authentication systems were social rather than scientific. A bottle was considered genuine because a credible person vouched for it, or because it came from a credible source, or because the label and cork looked right to people who had seen many labels and corks. Chemical analysis was rarely applied because it was expensive and often ambiguous in its results. A collector who submits a bottle for chemical authentication is implicitly acknowledging doubt about it, which devalues the bottle before any analysis is done. The wine market had been operating on trust for a century. Kerniawan understood this precisely. He was not selling wine. He was selling provenance, and provenance was a story he had made himself very good at telling. What wine is, and what it has always been. The wines at the center of the Kerniawan case were expensive because of what surrounded them, rather than what was in them. The label, the producer, the history, the story of previous ownership. These were the product. The liquid was the medium through which the story was delivered. This is not a cynical observation about wine. Wine is one of the most chemically complex beverages humans consume, containing hundreds of flavor compounds that interact in ways that science cannot fully predict or replicate. Flavor depends on soil geology, on annual weather patterns, on how a vine was pruned, on when fruit was picked, on fermentation temperature, on the age and origin of the oak barrel, on storage conditions over years or decades. No two bottles from the same vineyard in the same vintage are precisely identical. But wine is also interesting in a way that goes entirely beyond chemistry. It is one of the few beverages that has consistently served as a carrier for meaning beyond its own consumption. For 1.3 billion Catholics, wine has been the blood of Christ at the Eucharist for 2,000 years. For the Greeks, it was the technology of civilization that distinguished free men from barbarians. For Rome, it was the infrastructure of empire, transported in standardized containers across 40 provinces. For monasteries in the post-Roman centuries, it was the reason to keep knowledge alive, to keep records, to keep observing which parcel of land produced better fruit than the parcel next to it. For Napoleon III, it was a national brand requiring classification. For Kerniawan, It was the most lucrative narrative market he could find. None of these relationships with wine is simply about the liquid. The Greek word for the toasts exchanged at a symposium, propoma, meant literally, "what is drunk before," signifying that the wine came before the substance of the gathering it enabled. Wine was not the point. Wine made the point possible. Every tradition that has organized itself around wine has understood this implicitly, which is why Cornillon's fraud worked so well. He was selling the story that wine carries, and the story was worth more than the wine. The global wine market today is worth approximately $400 billion annually. 3/4 of it is consumed in Europe and North America, by populations that have no memory of making wine themselves and no particular need for the product beyond preference. Wine competes in those markets with beer, spirits, water, and a dozen categories of other beverages. It wins on the accumulated weight of everything it carries: the Georgian qvevri, the Roman amphorae, the Cistercian monks walking their fields, the 1855 broker who wrote down a price, the French judges reaching for their ballots in 1976, the man in Arcadia who knew that a story about wine is worth more than the wine itself. A bottle of wine carries all of that, invisibly, alongside whatever is in the glass. Back to the buried jar. The 2017 discovery at Gata Gora changed the timeline of wine in a way that its discoverers found philosophically significant. The sites are in the Kfemo-Kartli region of Georgia, an area that has been making wine in buried clay jars for more than 8,000 years, without interruption. The Soviet period tried to industrialize Georgian wine. Collective farms replaced estate vineyards. Qvevri were sometimes broken and not replaced. But in many villages, the tradition continued because it was the way wine was made, and no other method had fully supplanted it. The same qualities that made qvevri wine unfashionable for most of the 20th century turned out to be precisely what a new generation of wine drinkers wanted. The amber color from skin contact, the tannins, the cloudiness, the absence of the clean fruit flavors that modern winemaking optimizes for. In the 21st century, these were not flaws. They were the point. The natural wine movement, which had been building since the 1980s in France and accelerated sharply after 2010, rejected the techniques that had dominated production since the 1970s. Industrial yeast strains, added sulfites, fining and filtration, micro-oxygenation. What it wanted instead was wine that showed the character of a specific place in a specific year, made with minimal technological intervention. This is a description of qvevri wine that could have been written in 4000 BC. The innovation of the natural wine movement is that it rediscovered a set of practices predating virtually every other wine tradition and declared them to be the future. Sommeliers in London and Tokyo now carry bottles from Georgian producers to tables where customers pay as much for a qvevri orange wine as they would for a decent Burgundy. The oldest wine in the world is also the most exciting wine in the world. That probably says something about the wine. It definitely says something about us. Stephen Spurrier died in 2021 at 79. He spent the last years of his life making wine in the Languedoc at a small property he and his wife had bought in the 1990s. He said in interviews that the judgment of Paris had not been intended as an attack on French wine. He had expected the French wines to win, which is partly why he had framed the event as a bicentennial celebration rather than a competition. The California wines winning had been, from his perspective, a genuine surprise. What he had not anticipated was the French response. Not the commercial adaptation, which eventually came, but the initial refusal to accept the data. He had discovered that prestige, once accumulated over centuries, does not easily accept the invitation to revise itself. In the mountains south of Tbilisi, the new wine season is marked by the Ritveli festival, the harvest celebration that has ended summer in this region for as long as anyone has been counting. Grapes come in from the hillside vineyards. The juice flows into the buried qvevri, sealed in for winter. The yeasts go to work in the dark. In spring, the jars are opened. What comes out has been shaped by the particular soil of that hillside, the particular weather of that year, the particular decisions of the person who tends that vineyard, and 8,000 years of accumulated practice. It is amber and tannic and complex, and unlike anything produced in Burgundy or Napa Valley. The Greek judges at a symposium would have diluted it 3-1 and found it barbaric. The monks of Citeaux would not have known what to do with it. Napoleon III's brokers would have had no price category for it. Rudy Kurniawan would not have known how to fake it. But the people in the wine bars of London and New York are ordering it. And the people who buried the first qvevri in the earth at Gadatrili Gora 8,000 years ago would have recognized it immediately. Some things survive not because they were protected, but because they were